Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Fringe Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and today I'm joined by Mr. Chris Hattingh. Chris, how you doing, man?
Nicholas, always good to be on with you. Doing well, thanks. Let's wrap up this week on a good note, I hope.
Indeed. And of course, Mr. Marius Roodt, the fierce son of Benoni, the lion of the East Rand. Marius, how are you?
How's Nick? How's it, Chris? I'd also just like to do a shout out to my friend Kevin Ablett. He moved to Australia last year and he watched the Daily Fringe Show religiously, but it's his birthday today. So I just want to say happy birthday, Kevin. And I'll see you next month when you're out here. And I did promise to give him a shout out when I spoke to him earlier, so I better.
Happy birthday, Kev. Good boy.
All right, let's get into the news for today. And our first one is from, in fact, a former president of South Africa, but that former president who always seems to slip through our memories, which is Kgalema Motlanthe. He was recently speaking in an interview to the Center for, what are they called? The CDE?
Center for Development and Enterprise, my former employers.
Yes, indeed. And they were having a discussion about the future of South Africa. And he was asked about, what's the ANC's sort of future? And he said, the thing is, and I'm going to quote him here, I think the ANC is within its rights to embark on efforts to renew itself. However, South Africans should not be bound by that timetable. SA should move on, and at whatever point when the ANC believes it is a new formation, it must catch up with SA. I'm saying this because I think the results of the elections in 2016 as well as last year indicate that we are in a period of our politics being in a state of flux, which must necessarily result in a realignment of political forces. I don't think the current political parties represent the future. I think the kind of formations that are going to take this country forward are still to come and will be fashioned by realignment. The parties that are going to be serious players going forward are still to emerge. So, if those who perhaps can't remember, Motlanthe actually ran for leadership of the ANC. He was also president for a short amount of time before 2009, after Mbeki was kicked out, because I think Zuma didn't want to get into the presidency yet. They were still cleaning up some of the corruption stuff associated with him, and he wanted the charges against him dropped, and he wanted a mandate and all those things. So he let Kgalema be a sort of a seat warmer for him, and Kgalema.
I think it was also Zuma wasn't an MP at the time, I think.
Right, exactly. And Kgalema was also, very. He was a good seat warmer. He's pretty reasonable. He ran against Zuma in that sort of halfway through Zuma's term in what was that ANC conference?
2012.
Was it 2013? 2012.
2012.
Yes, 2012. Yeah. And he was crushed by the ANC's internal vote. And ever since then, he seems to have kind of drifted off to the periphery of the ANC. He hasn't, he pops up in the media quite often, but really he doesn't seem to have a huge amount of impact on the party. I remember him when he was interviewed after his defeat in his electoral conference against Zuma. They asked him what he was going to do, and he said something like, I'm going to tend to my garden. And then he went on to talk about
I think he said he wants to be a soccer talent coach, or a scout.
Sorry. Right. Yeah. So in other words, he knew that his future in the ANC was perhaps going to be limited. And I think they gave him a sort of flag waving role as head of political school in the ANC or something. But clearly he hasn't had a huge influence of the party. So Marius, do you think that other people in the ANC, is he expressing a view that you think other people in the ANC have also come to, or do you think he's very much a outside voice on this, and that he's not really in touch with the rest of the party anymore?
Look, I think what it does tell you is that there's definitely some people in the ANC are thinking about what's happening in the party, and maybe even thinking about a post-ANC South Africa. But yeah, I'm not sure if he has all that much influence in the party. He never seemed like a guy who, was at all that much personal popularity within the party. He became deputy president on kind of Zuma's coattails. He was part of that slate and what have you. And he's not on the NEC, unlike Thabo Mbeki and Jacob Zuma being past ANC presidents. They're ex officio members. So they're entitled to 10 meetings and so on, which Kgalema Motlanthe isn't. So, I mean, I would imagine that he doesn't have all that much influence in the party. But I think if somebody like Motlanthe, who's obviously a former senior figure in the party, and he was president of the country, and deputy president, and obviously deputy president of the ANC, and also secretary general under Thabo Mbeki. So he's somebody who's obviously been, involved in ANC internal politics for many years. I'd be very surprised if these kind of conversations aren't going on in the ANC, maybe with the kind of old guard people like Thabo Mbeki and so on. But I don't know how many people who actually are now influential in the ANC, or kind of Fikile Mbalulas or Gwede Matashas and whatever if they're actually thinking about this. But I think this is a very timely warning, and I'm glad that somebody like Kgalema Motlanthe, who is an ANC stalwart, is saying this, because South Africa does have to start thinking about what it's going to be like after the ANC, and it could be sooner than we think. Maybe after 2024, almost definitely after 2029. And it's something that the party needs to start thinking about. And I think it's also a warning to the ANC. I think I might have mentioned in the show before, when a big hegemonic party like the ANC loses power, if it's not very careful, it falls apart very quickly. We've seen it happen in other countries around the world. It's happened in Zambia. It's happened in Kenya. Even happened in Canada when the Conservative Party there lost an election badly and basically fell apart. The Conservatives had to form a new movement in Canada to run after that. So, and I think the same could happen to the ANC. It's happened to the ANC in the Western Cape. Remember in 2004, the ANC won 45% of the votes in the Western Cape. Now it's a 20% party in the Western Cape. And probably the only reason it's getting that kind of support is because it's still quite strong in the rest of the country. So I think when a big party like the ANC loses power, and it's the only reason it actually exists anymore is still just to actually be in power, and for patronage reasons and so on. Once it loses that reason, then it falls apart very quickly. And I think the ANC needs to start thinking about that. And if the ANC loses support in 2024, not loses support, loses an election in 2024, I think it wouldn't be a mistake to bet that by 2034 there won't even be an ANC on the ballot paper. So I think the ANC needs to start thinking about a future when it's not in government, and if it doesn't, I think the ANC won't even exist in South Africa within 10 years.
Yeah, it's quite interesting to think, and it would be quite an end of an era, because the ANC has been at least a somewhat significant force in our politics since 1912, or when was
1912.
1912, yeah.
It was 1912.
And our second biggest party has also got a very old pedigree, because the DA at least goes back to 1958 when it split, when the Progressive Party split from 59, split from the United Party. But the United Party goes all the way back to the South African Party, which is also one of those founding parties of South Africa. So if we do see the disappearance of the ANC, it will be sort of the end of a century-long political party, which would be quite something. Chris, what do you make of this? Interesting also, Motlanthe was questioned on a range of other things. For example, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which he condemned, which runs in contrast to what the mainstream of the party, and particularly some of Ramaphosa, have said. And he was also asked about collective bargaining agreements. So there's been this debate, and I'm sure you're very familiar with it, because I think the Free Market Foundation was involved in some of this, but where big unions and big business could reach collective bargaining agreements over wages, and then the minister would be able to extend them to the entire industry. Motlanthe, in contrast to the rest of the ANC, came out against this, which seems to suggest to me that he's fairly at odds with the party. What do you make of all this, Chris?
Yeah, it might not even be up to Motlanthe or the ANC whether they remain in power anymore, unless they resort to other sort of methods in coming years. I think that momentum is very much against the party. And I don't think that, as radical as those ideas and reforms that Motlanthe touches on are, and even if people within the party, within the NEC, maybe they debate these things every single day, I don't think that they will take that leap of implementing them, because it requires them giving up a lot of their most dearly held sort of tenets, central pillars of their ideology. So even if they're open to some peripheral surface reforms, for example, allowing some competition in electricity or with the rail networks, I don't think it'll be to the level which actually kickstarts growth to a significant extent in South Africa. And as that unemployment rate increases, it'll just make people more desperate to maybe go elsewhere. And Motlanthe, he touches on sort of that parties, I'm paraphrasing here, but the post-ANC political landscape, parties or a party that might replace it doesn't exist as yet. So just for him, I think still, even though he talks about there's reforms in one way, in another way, he finds it difficult to imagine any sort of entity other than the ANC. I mean, he's not willing yet to even touch on those current political parties that exist, that are currently ruling in coalitions in the biggest metros of the country. I mean, that's already a big hit against the ANC, never mind what might come in 2024 and 2029. So noteworthy, such a big figure in the party and its history, but not, I don't foresee that, he's really going to go and brief them and change their minds to do very radical things in the next few months or so.
So, Marius, my last question to you is just whether Motlanthe might have a role to play in South Africa's post-ANC politics. So he's clearly out of step with the party, and he's clearly sort of at least come to terms with the idea that the ANC may not be the ruling party going forward. And I see Moonchild here in the comments suggested that maybe he's planning to start his own party. Do you think that he could either be a figure in sort of uniting a coalition to take over post the ANC, or do you think he would have any success if he started his own party? He's got a mostly good record, but he's also got some bad stuff too. Like as another commenter pointed out, he voted to disband the Scorpions.
Yeah, exactly. And also, I mean, I've looked now at Motlanthe. I mean, let me see if he's 73 yet. I mean, he turned 73 this year, so yeah, I really, same as people been talking about Thabo Mbeki, there was some talk about Thabo Mbeki making a comeback in the ANC. And I mean, the man's 80, I think now, or he's very close to 80. And I think we need to, it's fine for people like Motlanthe to come and chat about, the renewal of the party, but I think we need to start looking outside the ANC, and I think that includes looking at past ANC figures, including kind of reformers, inverted commas, people like Motlanthe and so on. But just on the point of the ANC, I do think a crisis has a very good way of concentrating the mind. And I think we saw in this country, the National Party, when South Africa was in deep crisis in the 1980s, decided to reform the system. We saw it happen in India in the early 90s when that country's economy was also in a lot of trouble. And the Indian National Congress, was also a leftist movement, reformed the country, got rid of what was called the license Raj, and set India onto its current path of economic development, 5% average a year, more or less, since the early 90s. So, I mean, or what could happen could be...
It's worth saying that after enacting those reforms, the INC political figures responsible for that were basically sort of disowned by the party, despite their enormous success.
But then they did carry on those kind of reformist paths with people like Manmohan Singh, who was quite a reformist prime minister under the Indian National Congress and so on. But the other thing is, we might go the way of ZANU-PF in Zimbabwe, who has not reformed at all and just held on to power. And we all know, I'm sure everybody listening here, we don't have to rehash Zimbabwe's history here. But instead of reforming, it carried on. And, Zimbabwe's economy now is probably, I don't know, it's probably smaller than the Eastern Cape's economy, I would guess. And just one thing, I see Daniel, one of the commenters said, we're not going to talk about Corbyn Bosch's switch hit. He's talking about yesterday's One Day Cup final. Maybe if we've got time at the end of the show, we can have a quick chat about that, but let's see.
Yes, I had no idea what he meant when I saw that comment, because I know nothing about cricket except that I quite like it, but more in theory than in practice. But anyway, all right, let's move on to our next story. And this is about an old family-owned South African business which has been in operation in SA for at least 40 years. And it's shutting down. This is a freight company, and the name of it is, I was mocked mercilessly for my pronunciation of it before the show. So, Marius, what's the company called?
It's the way you said is Massyn Vervoer, but I think you pronounce it Massyn Vervoer. But I think Chris might even be able to get the pronunciation better than I did there.
Right. So this company was started by a guy called Frans Massyn 40 years ago. It employs about 280 people, drives about 120 trucks. So, not a huge company. I mean, 280 people is not an enormous number of employees, but it's a sizable amount. And it's shutting down. The company has announced recently, they say they're going to be paying all their creditors and things. But when asked as to why they're going to be shutting down this sort of 40-year-old company, they just said that freight in South Africa is no longer really profitable. They cited a whole number of things, and I'm actually going to go get a little bit into the details here because I think that they're quite interesting. Firstly, the new costs of trucks have increased massively. Tires, parts, trailers, salaries, all of the operating costs have gone up. The cost of steel, which is part of what informs the price of the truck trailers, has gone up by something like 80%. But more than that, the big thing that seems to be really hurting the profitability of this freight business is insurance costs. So since the July riots last year, the owners of this company said that unrest insurance has gone up by 1,800%, 1,800%. Also, clients who are unwilling to accept a tariff increase, they say that basically they can't. Customers don't want to pay more than 19,000 rand to ship a trailer to Cape Town, but it costs them at least 23,000 rand to do so. They say that sometimes they can't even make a profit of about 3,000 rand per trip that one of their trucks makes, and yet the trucks are constantly subject to being attacked and looted, and this can amount to 30,000 rands of damages in a single theft. And a lot of the time they can't even claim for that because insurance just won't cover it, or they can't insure everything. So all of this, there's just constantly having to replace things on the truck. They have to replace the slide covers. They have to replace the lights, which are attacked and stolen. Often they have to put spikes on the back of the trailers so that people can't climb onto them and loot them. And the end result here is that the 280 people are going to lose their jobs. And the owners, of course, I presume, are probably going to move into another industry or possibly overseas, which means they'll no longer be paying tax. Now, luckily for this particular company, it looks like almost all of the employees are going to be hired by other freight companies, and so will continue to be absorbed into the industry. But that presumably means that there are going to be people who are just trying to enter into the industry who won't be able to get jobs now because of that. So people have definitely lost out with this company closing down. And I think this really is another great example of the problems that law and order causes when it breaks down. Chris, you're very interested in freight and transport. What are your thoughts on this story?
Well, just to mention, whenever people tell me Atlas Shrugged is only fiction, I mean, here's another example of society breaking down. So all of you who love going on about objectivism, the ideas work, or in this case, don't work.
Let's not start infighting on the podcast right now.
Right, yeah, we'll keep that for offline. Sorry, I forgot. No, that's already a strike against me. Look, it's sad and interesting that with the government's lack of ability to protect rail, first of all, and also just enforcing a monopoly in rail, they've forced people to use more road freight, and even that can't be well protected or insured. As law and order continues to decline. And while government focuses on these ephemeral plans of reindustrialization, re-upping manufacturing, of localization, they can't even do basic things like ensuring road maintenance gets done. All the money that goes to bodies such as SANRAL and provincial and municipal road agencies and services, all of that seems to be going, I guess, towards certain connected people's own transport, making sure that their tires are big enough and strong enough and reinforced enough to survive all the potholes. They're fine, but that money doesn't actually go towards maintaining roads. So a sad indictment, I believe. In that article that I shared this morning, there's an independent road freight media publisher, Patrick O'Leary, and I think he summed it up very well when he said, Massyn Vervoer has not failed, South Africa has failed. And that, I think, is indicative across the board, where businesses across supply chains and value chains, from farmers to farm workers to the freight companies themselves, to even consumers and shopping malls and businesses like Pick n Pay, Checkers and Woolies, they're all trying in their different ways to weather the storm. But the policies and actions by government are sort of all coming together to make it exceedingly more difficult to operate in the country. And one should also keep in mind that this will have an effect on South Africa's exports. So for all of the talk about the commodities boom and how well, for example, the Western Cape does with wine, and citrus exports and that sort of thing, maybe filling a gap that Ukraine now can't fulfill due to the Russian invasion. Even then, exporters are going to struggle getting their goods across South Africa's roads and through the ports and out into the rest of the world. So just keep in mind with these isolated stories, they might look isolated, but they point to general climate, and all of this means increased prices for goods that you and your family go and buy at shopping malls.
Right. So I think this is one of the other aspects of this is how South Africa is increasingly suffering from sort of interconnected, sort of factor interconnected problems. If these problems weren't as severe, they wouldn't be as closely interconnected. But now we're running into things like, well, how do we fix something like unemployment, right? Well, we need to change the business environment and the labor laws, and we need to make it easier to invest and easier to hire and fire. But that's not really going to be that useful if we start producing a whole bunch of stuff that we then can't export because the roads are too dangerous or they're too potholed or the railway tracks have all been stolen or whatever. So, Marius, it looks like the post-ANC government is going to have a real job on its hands trying to fix all that stuff. Our infrastructure, which was once much better, seems to not really be coping so well.
Yeah, no, I think that's a key point. If there's infrastructure collapse, it's got all kinds of knock-on effects. And we've seen what's happened with lots of businesses. There was Austral Foods in Standerton. I think they didn't get water for however long, and you just can't function. I mean, they're growing chickens. You can't grow, or not growing chickens, breeding chickens. You can't breed chickens without any water. There's also Clover in Northwest moved to Durban because of lack of infrastructure. There was another story. Can't remember what the company was, but it's the people who make Omar rusks. And the road from the factory was just so bad that they couldn't use it anymore, because when people got their rusks, all the rusks were broken because it had been on this road. They were so terrible, full of potholes, and obviously the boxes of rusk were shaking, and then things got broken. Obviously, nobody wants this, to open their Omar rusk packet and there's just like all these crumbs or whatever you want. Yeah, exactly. You want your nice rusk you can dip in your coffee in the morning. So it's got all these kinds of knock-on effects. But I think also an interesting thing that was in that article was that there's also the issue of other companies who were also paying late, as if I recall, Massyn Vervoer was saying, or refusing to take on, pay the higher fees which they needed to stay profitable. So I think it's all, obviously a lot of this is the government's fault, but I think it's also, maybe the corporate environment in South Africa where, and we've also heard stories where, and it's not just the government that takes very long to pay small businesses. It's also an issue with big corporates where they sit on an invoice where they're happy to pay it and they have the money, but instead of paying it immediately, they wait 90 days or whatever it is. And, for a lot of small businesses, they need their money for their cash flow and can often be a big problem for them. So, yeah, I think this is all quite a complex issue. And it's not just the government. I mean, I think obviously the government is the primary problem there, but I think it's also an issue of how businesses function in South Africa. So, yeah, and obviously it's terrible for Massyn Vervoer. I think anybody, we can all remember driving on South Africa's highways and you always see a Massyn Vervoer truck somewhere on the road.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point you raised there about how the private sector also seems to be slipping a bit. And I think this is, at least in my anecdotal experience, kind of true, that we once had, this very sharp divide between government, which was almost always bad, but sometimes okay, and the private sector, which was almost always good and sometimes bad. And now it seems as though the two are much more similar to each other in terms of efficiency, particularly from some of these really big organizations. I mean, anyone who's had dealings with a South African bank knows that, quite often you can be really messed around. And a lot of big corporates in South Africa, I really think that the country is suffering from a crisis of middle management, where we just don't have a lot of great middle managers anywhere in the country, because those are exactly the kind of people who can go and get jobs overseas and do stuff there. Chris, final topic on this, final thoughts on this?
No, nothing huge to add, just that consumers and those watching, when you see fewer goods on store shelves and that kind of thing, don't immediately call for something like the Competition Commission to investigate and find out why prices have increased or whatever. These other factors that we've talked about now, those are the biggest reasons why there are shortages and price increases. So keep that in mind when you encounter these things in your daily life.
Right. All right. So let us talk about something that we haven't mentioned for a while, but it's still lurking in the background there, and that is the national health insurance. This is the great grand government scheme to nationalize the healthcare industry, although some of the details of it are not always clear because it hasn't really been implemented yet. But we had recently, speaking to a pharmacy show in Sandton, the Deputy Director General in charge of the NHI at the Department of Health, Dr. Nicholas Crisp, who is a guy who we have criticized before because he kind of seems like the evil dark lord of the NHI, has said they hope the NHI bill will go through Parliament by the end of the year. The bill has been sitting before Parliament for 2.5 years already and has not been implemented yet. And basically, Dr. Crisp said that the health department was completely committed to NHI. They were not going to stop, implementing it. This was the way to go, and everyone must just get used to the fact that this was how it was going to go down. Chris, let me start with you. Do you want to maybe rehash some of the reasons why we're not a big fan of NHI, and also why they're so keen on NHI, despite some of the concerns about it, like affordability, for example?
Well, maybe on the keenness point, and this might just be one of a few reasons, but there's nothing, I guess, more attractive to sell to voters when you're becoming more desperate than quote-unquote free healthcare. So if they can pass this now, maybe this year before the next elections, that's one more item to try and sell.
Right, and it's a strange promise to make because we already have free universal healthcare in South Africa. So it's not clear to me why we need a second one, unless, of course, the first one didn't work.
Right. Yeah, and let's not focus on the actual reforms that could be done in both the private and public sectors. It would be silly to deny that there aren't issues in the private sector, but all of these were covered in the health market inquiry of a few years ago. So government could be implementing those reforms, but that requires actual work instead of promising things like the NHI. I mean, in a nutshell, the NHI will involve the monopolization of the management of all healthcare in the country. It'll create another great big pot of gold that will incentivize more cronyism and corruption. I mean, talking about state capture and how a lot of analysts and commentators say, how did this happen? How did this happen? With the NHI, we're going to incentivize those same behaviors again and just increase the stakes for who can control the pot of gold. So it won't just be only be confined to the Department of Health, but to other government agencies and departments as well. I mean, Dr. Crisp, not to only focus on him, because NHI was also strongly punted by Dr. Aaron Motsoaledi, who's now trying to right the ship at Home Affairs. So we shouldn't let Motsoaledi get away with.
That's really a hospital pass, having to fix Home Affairs.
Yeah, right. Yeah, there we can't even handle cable breaks, never mind actual service delivery of renewing passports and licenses and the like. Yeah, just to finish off, the NHI, it's fiscally impossible. That doesn't mean that that government won't try. I mean, when has that really stopped them before? But at the very least, maybe they could focus on fixing some of the issues in public healthcare before doing things like the NHI or giving SAA another bailout or sort of pie in the sky things like that. Maybe just focus on actual service delivery for lower to middle income South Africans. If NHI goes ahead, those richer politicians and citizens, private citizens, will still be able to go overseas to get their healthcare, as happened in Zimbabwe, for example. But the majority of poor Black South Africans will still be forced to go to ever lower quality public health facilities. I don't see how just giving the public sector more money and sort of control is going to fix the deep structural issues in healthcare.
Right. So exactly, one of the effects of NHI will likely be that rather than the idea, I guess, behind NHI is to make the public sector more like the private sector. But in reality, it's probably just going to make the private sector more like the public sector, in which case those people in South Africa who've broken into the middle class, who have that basic healthcare package, who have that sort of basic insurance now in the current system, well, they'll suddenly be reduced to getting the same care they would get if they didn't have a job at all and were living off of free government hospitals. And as anyone who has been in those hospitals will tell you, that ain't fun. Marius, your thoughts before we close the show?
Yeah, I mean, it's a form of magical thinking where Dr. Crisp is basically saying we are going to have NHI and it's going to work without actually thinking it through. It's clear it's going to be an issue, and the government needs to focus on fixing the government hospitals first, and we know they are a mess. I mean, just in the last week or so, we saw there was a viral video coming out allegedly from Rahima Musa Hospital in Johannesburg, where pregnant women were forced to lie on the floor and they weren't getting, I don't know if it's because the hospitals were too full or they were short-staffed or whatever the case was, but simply not working. And
And the
there's-
CEO of the hospital said that video was a fake, despite
Yeah,
the fact
but
that
I mean-
stories like this have been coming out of hospitals forever.
Exactly. I mean, let's remember. I mean, geez, there's been terrible things happening in the public healthcare system. Just think back on Life is Sedimeni, which is one of the greatest crimes in post-apartheid South Africa. 150 dead people, and nobody's paid the price for that. And we've just kind of swept that under the carpet. We'll probably see a lot more Life is Sedemenis go in the future if this does go through. And yeah, single payer healthcare doesn't work in rich countries. It's definitely not going to work in a place like South Africa. And we simply don't have the money for it. And it's just, as I said, it's a form of magical thinking to think we can even implement it.
Indeed. Anyway, that is all the time we have for today. We hope that you found the show interesting. We will, of course, be back next week on the Daily Friend Show. I hope that you all have a most magnificent, wonderful, and fantastic end of the week and weekend. And we'll see you next week for the Daily Friend Show. Cheers, everyone.